Hello there, I'm James Bays. The battle lines in the war in Ukraine seem to have changed little in recent months, with analysts calling it a stalemate in Europe's worst conflict since World War II. But then a lightning attack by Ukrainian forces into Russian territory last week took not only Russia by surprise, but the rest of the world too. Ukrainian troops are reported to be advancing in Russia's Kursk region, and Moscow has ordered the evacuation of civilians from there and neighbouring Belgorod. So why is the surprise operation being launched now? How's it being seen within Russia and Ukraine? We'll discuss all of this more with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
Ukrainian troops push deeper into Russia's western Kursk region. The surprise attack is their most significant incursion into Russia since it invaded Ukraine in February 2022.
We are pushing the war into the aggressor's territory. Ukraine is proving that it can really bring justice and guarantees exactly the kind of pressure that is needed. Pressure on the aggressor.
Ukrainian media reports citing unnamed security officials say the incursion is aimed at destabilizing Russia and stretching its forces, and that the Kursk region has been used by the Russian military throughout the war as a platform to fire into Ukraine. Thousands of Russian civilians have been evacuated from the area, with many being sent to temporary accommodation.
We started moving people out. It was quite difficult because the Ukrainians are shelling the civilian population. They shelled a paramedic who sacrificed himself while moving civilians out.
Russia has also begun moving people from the neighbouring Belgorod region that's come under attack. The Russian Air Force and military have been attacking Ukrainian targets inside Russia, but have failed to dislodge them. Russia's president called Ukraine's action a provocation.
The Kyiv regime has undertaken another large-scale provocation and indiscriminately shelled civilian buildings, residential houses, ambulances with different types of weapons and including missiles.
The advances by Ukrainian forces follow what many military analysts describe as a state of stalemate in the wider war. Russia controls around 18% of Ukraine's territory and has used its greater number of troops to make gradual advances. President Zelensky maintains that Ukraine will not negotiate and will not relinquish Ukrainian soil to Russia. But while Ukraine has benefited from Western support with the US, UK and EU countries that have provided billions of dollars worth of military aid and weapons, Kyiv fears if the US presidential election in November results in a win for Donald Trump, all that may be jeopardized. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's show you the state of the battlefield right now. Not much has changed inside Ukraine, or not a great deal. There's been a grueling war of attrition there, with heavily fortified front lines and a very large death toll on both sides. But what's new is here. The Ukrainians kept this plan a secret, and the element of surprise seemed to have worked so far. An offensive into the Russian province of Kursk. Some reports say they've gone more than 30 kilometers from the border, deep into Russia. As villages were overrun, a state of emergency was declared, and civilians have been evacuated from parts of the neighbouring province of Belgorod as well as from Kursk. So let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. In Kyiv, Olesia Horyainova is the co-founder of the Ukrainian Security and Cooperation Center. In Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer is an independent Russian defense analyst. And in Bath in the UK, Patrick Bury is a defense and security analyst at the University of Bath and a former British Army officer. Welcome to all of you. Let me start in Kyiv. As we've been saying, Olesia, this took everyone by surprise. And I think the big question is, what is Ukraine trying to do here? What's the aim? What have you gleaned?
Well, we couldn't pick a better time for this operation because we just received, Ukrainian forces just received Western ammunition, started to receive that in the end of spring and in the beginning of summer. And we just started the mobilization processes in Ukraine. So yeah, this operation took in planning not as much time as it could. And this operation is ongoing. We cannot claim that it is a Ukrainian operation for now because Ukrainian officials are not claiming that. But the Kursk operation gained much result as of now. And we are talking about captivity of Russian soldiers. We're talking about Russian military infrastructure in Kursk region destroyed. And just the fact that this is the first time since the beginning of since the Second World War when foreign army is in the territory of Russian Federation. So
yeah, but Alicia, just to be clear to me, from what you're hearing, do you think Ukraine plans to hold this territory, or is it going to withdraw at some point in the near future?
Everything I can say on that matter is that the operation continues in complete secrecy and decisions are taken by the operational command. So let us see what is next.
OK, Patrick, it's going to be pretty hard to judge whether this is a success or not if we don't know what they're trying to do, what the objectives are, isn't it?
Absolutely, James, and we can only really judge it ultimately on its outcome. Look, I think there's a couple of things we can take away. There was very little info at the start of this, but there's been senior Ukrainian military commanders say since it started that they've got different objectives. One of them mentioned that it's about drawing off Russian forces and military focus from the Donetsk, where they were actually getting into a groove and starting to make incremental gains. And there's other ones. One is about the morale for the Ukrainian people and the military, especially the army, which has been suffering a lot of heavy fighting and actually having to give ground in Donetsk for the last year. And again, we had their failed offensive the summer last year. So this is a morale boost. And I think finally and importantly, in terms of the operation objectives, the other one is to show that they can counterpunch still, that the Russian border is not safe. Even areas which have not been fought over are not safe. The Ukraine has the capability and the will to do this, and that it will sow some sort of panic and indeed destabilize the Russian regime. I think they're the operation objectives. But what I would say, and I think what you're kind of getting at with your question here is, and Imogen sort of picked up on it again, an operation like this where they've got a good deal of supplies, strong operational security, and then managed to use mechanized forces with an air defense and electronic warfare bubble over them to protect, that takes a lot of planning. So this is being planned for a while. There were some indications in the US media that US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin had asked the Ukrainians not to go ahead with some operation a couple of months ago. Question mark that. But if you take that this operation probably took a good few months to prepare, and a few months ago it was looking much more likely that Donald Trump would get into the White House in January, and that if he did on day two, he would be pushing for the Ukrainians to reach some sort of deal, then this operation makes much more sense strategically and that may come to what we would expect to see. And I think the Ukrainians will desire to hold at least some of the territory that they've got so far.
So far, more of the information, Pavel, has come out of Moscow about what's going on than out of Kyiv. The Ukrainians have been relatively quiet about this. The latest things I've seen, the governor of Kursk region, the Russian governor there, says Ukraine has advanced 12 kilometers, controls 28 settlements. But there are other figures suggesting that the Ukrainians have gone as far as 30 kilometers. I also saw one report saying Ukraine controls 430 square kilometers. That is the size of a small country, a pretty small country. I looked it up. It's almost exactly the size of the Caribbean island nation of Barbados. Pavel, tell us what you know about the current situation.
Governor Smirnov said that the Ukrainians have occupied an area of 12 kilometers wide, deep, and 40 kilometers wide. At the same time, he said we don't know, the Russians don't know where the Ukrainian mobile groups are. There's no established front line at all. So that means that Ukrainian mobile groups could be much deeper and operating deep behind Russian lines. And that's apparently the main success so far of the Ukrainians, something that they failed to do last year. They broke through the Russian lines. They are now operationally free. They're moving they're fighting a mobile war. What they wanted to do last year failed. Now they are, though this is in a very different area. But basically that makes sense. You attack where the enemy is weaker, not where he's stronger. And that has changed apparently very much the overall position. The strategic position is shifting. The Russian offensive that began in spring achieved a lot of tactical success, but apparently no strategic breakthrough. And it seems Russian reserves have been depleted to an extent. So now when the Ukrainians, who apparently managed to put together quite some reserves, punch through the Russian lines, Russia is struggling not just to push them out of Russian territory, but just to stop them. And I believe that in the coming couple of months till October, maybe, or into October, when the autumn wet time comes, Ukrainians will be trying to capitalize on this breakthrough, maybe spreading out. And also the governor said that 2,000 Russian civilians are under Ukrainian occupation, and that Russia does not know what's with them, and that 120,000 have been evacuated, and the 60,000 are still on the move. So we're talking about 200,000 Russians being right now becoming refugees in Kursk and in Belgorod. So this is, of course, a very serious problem for Moscow.
Patrick, when I first heard about this last week, I thought it was going to be straight in and quick out, a very, very quick incursion, but they are still there. It's a very audacious operation. As a former soldier and military strategist, does an operation like this also, though, carry pretty big risks?
It does, yeah, and I was surprised too, James, because we basically were watching the Ukrainians having to slowly and at high cost to the Russians, but nevertheless continuously give small amounts of ground in Donetsk. And so to think that they had these parts of elite brigades ready to go for this punch and were able to pull it off. It looks like the Russians, actually, the military near Susa, where the breakthrough happened, were telling them that there was a buildup of Ukrainian forces, but the Russian high command didn't act on it. So, from my perspective, this is an operation that's been planned really well. And exactly like Pavel said, one of the things that made it a stalemate down in Donetsk and Zaporizhia, for example, is that the Russians have got what we call persistent ISR, which means intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. They're reliant on their drones, and those drones can see up to like 50 kilometers behind the front line. Very difficult to move without being seen, very difficult to concentrate your forces without being seen. And therefore, what the Ukraine has managed to do, that's basically why a lot of their attacks have failed, they're just getting seen and hit before you can do anything. But what they've managed to do by moving the focus to Kursk is an area where the Russians have far less persistent ISR. So they've been able to concentrate. They've used their armor, their German Marder tanks, their American Stryker and Bradley vehicles. They've punched through. And then they've filled it with a lot of Western air defense assets to protect it. So you basically want to put a bubble over your mechanized forces. And then you have electronic warfare capabilities as well, which are trying to disrupt the drones that the Russians are going to send in, shoot down their jets, etc. So yeah, it's been well planned, and exactly like Pavel said, they've broken through, and now the initiative is with those guys. The question is, in the longer term, will the Russian build-up start to show and push them back a bit?
Alicia, let's bring you in again. If I go back just over a year and 2 months ago, June the 24th, that's when the founder of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, staged his rebellion. That ended up very badly for him, and everyone thought that Putin had been strengthened. So now, as you look at this, your view from Kyiv, how humiliating is this for the Russian president?
Well, this is a great question, James, because yes, this is, as I said before, this is the first time since the Second World War the foreign army has entered Russian territory and inflicted a significant defeat. So, of course, this is an incredible blow to Putin and his forces. The official losses have not been announced, but we understand that the losses in the Kursk region are heavy because Russia had lost the entire line of equipment, from infantry to armored vehicles to tanks, helicopters, aircraft. Everything has been destroyed or captured, and meanwhile, the ammunition captured from the Russians is now being used against them to continue the operation. We have that information from the operation ground. The defensive line on which billions of rubles had been spent has been breached. This is another case of humiliation for the Kremlin, I guess. And it is also clear that Putin has become even more afraid of his own military and the fact that they are gaining weight. So he does not declare martial law, but a counter-terrorist operation, leaving an FSB in charge. But meanwhile, just recently, just a couple of hours ago, Putin held a meeting with high military representatives in Russia, and he gave a task to go to the Kursk region and to defend the Russian territory to MOD and to the border guard service. So this is quite interesting to see how the powers are working under this very, very interesting situation in Russia.
Okay, let's see, Pavel. You might see it differently. I don't see. Tell us how this is being seen in Moscow by the military leadership and ordinary people. And you heard Alicia there talk about the FSB being put in charge, the spy agency, not the military. Putin could declare martial law or say that Russia was in a state of war. Is Putin, talking tough but doesn't want to spook the Russian people too much?
Putin is actually holding back. In the very beginning, he made a statement when he believed, as you believe, in the beginning, that this is going to be just a raid, go in, go out, as such raids happened before on the Ukrainian-Russian border. Now it's obviously a much more massive operation, and he's kind of, as it happens in such times, 24 years ago, Kursk also was on the news all the time, the Kursk nuclear submarine sunk. And in August 2000, and Putin kind of disappeared for several days from the news cycle. And right now, of course, he doesn't know. Apparently, he has no good news to say.
Because Pavel, that event 25 years ago, that was at the very start of Putin's rule, and it was a really bad moment for him. It was a really bad moment for him.
Yes, it was a very bad moment, and now it's maybe two. Because right now the Russian public is kind of frustrated. Of course, people who are being evacuated are very angry. In Moscow, well, it seems still a bit happening somewhere there. But again, it depends. If Russia has really depleted its reserves, how much that already reserves in the fighting that's happening for several months, intense fighting in the Donetsk region, and doesn't have enough battle-ready forces to swiftly curtail, stop, and push out the Ukrainians from Kursk region, that's a serious political problem. Maybe Putin will have to declare another wave of mobilization, which would be extremely unpopular. So the Russian Kremlin right now in Moscow is in a fix. What to do next? They're throwing in what they can find, and these are different pieces of army, paramilitary units, trying to stop the Ukrainians, trying to defend strategically important positions there, like the nuclear power plant in Kursk. And apparently not really knowing for sure where are the Ukrainian mobile units and where they can hit from any direction. And so this is a very serious crisis in the process of developing, of course.
Patrick, we've heard how the Russian people know all about the name Kursk, but of course President Putin is an avid reader and quoter of history, and of course Kursk was the site of one of the most decisive battles of World War II, the biggest tank battle in history. Do you think the historical resonance is important here too?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not Russian, but it obviously has massive resonance in terms of history. I think there'd be the maximum effort that the Russians would probably do is to protect, as Pavel said, that nuclear power plant first of all, and then behind it the city of Kursk. But I think, as we're seeing this plan develop, and the Ukrainians are still attacking as of today, but the longer it goes on with these breakthroughs, the difficult, because your enemy is rushing forces there, the more difficult it usually, doesn't always, but usually becomes to keep advancing. Also, you've got the whole sustainment issue of sustaining your own forces deeper into Russian territory over the longer term. So while there is a risk to, say, Kursk, I think the longer the longer it takes the Ukrainians to even get there, the less likely that becomes, and we're already a week into that operation. So, yeah, of course it has significance, but whether they actually get to Kursk, I think that's another question altogether.
Alicia, let's just turn to where we were in the war in Ukraine before this bold move by the Ukrainian side. And we talk about a stalemate, but actually in recent months and all this year, it's only been Russia that's been making slight gains throughout the year. Both sides have been losing manpower, huge losses, but of course Russia has a bigger source of manpower than Ukraine. So was Ukraine until this moment very much on the back foot?
Well, this is also a very interesting question because, yeah, as I said before, Russian offensive, the summer offensive, did not stop, and it was Russians had their successes as well. But this is actually interesting to see the comparison of their results and their results in Ukraine and in the eastern part of Ukraine and the results of Kursk operation, and to compare them in time wise and in result wise, because this was around 70 days we could take as duration Russian summer offensive in Ukraine. They've lost more than 100 soldiers in casualties, and they gained a couple of villages, and there were it is not comparable, I guess, with the Kursk operation with 6 days and almost 30 villages in Kursk region, and many armored vehicles and people captured into the Ukrainian captivity. So yeah, actually it was not easy for Ukrainian armed forces during this summer, but we can see one of the results I was talking about earlier of this operation in Kursk is that some of the reserves are already being pushed from the Kharkiv region and from the Kharkiv offensive. And as of yesterday, Ukrainian forces claimed that it was less attacks from the Russian side. In figures, it would be less in 20%.
Patrick, worryingly, we've already mentioned this, there is a nuclear dimension. In your assessment, do you think that the Ukrainians might be going for the Kursk nuclear plant? We've seen a fire reported at Zaporizhzhia. That's the nuclear plant in Ukraine, southeast Ukraine, that's held by Russia. Do you think that is a coincidence? Do you think that maybe some Ukrainian aim perhaps to try and swap one for the other?
Yeah, it would make sense as maybe a secondary or nice to have objective if you can get it, given the fact that the Russians have held Zaporizhzhia. But to take a place like that, you need to do it in the early days by surprise, essentially. And again, we've seen footage just in the last 24 hours of defences being dug around there. I would go with since things had actually calmed down around Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, I'd go with probably the more likely course of action being that the Russians have done something there in an attempt to show that we still have leverage over this. So just be careful what you do in case you get close to the Kursk power plant. But it is looking at some of the forward lines of own troops for the Ukrainians. It's just about within artillery range now. But of course, the Ukrainians don't play by, they play by the rules in a different way to the Russians. So they're not going to just, set up a bunch of artillery and start bombarding the Kursk power plant, I would have thought. They care more about their international reputation.
Pavel, in the past we've seen attacks inside Russia, but they were carried out by groups that have been helped by Ukraine, anti-Putin groups. How worried do you think the Kremlin will be that this will empower more of those groups who may well have been working with the Ukrainian army to prepare this incursion?
There were actually no real reports of these kind of volunteer units that are considered traitors and guiding the enemy. And Russia are really involved in this offensive. The latest today, I heard that there are at least 5. The Russian side says that there are at least 5 Ukrainian brigades involved in the offensive, 2 airborne and 3 heavy.
Okay,
And
Pavel, let me
that's a
stop you.
lot of
Let me
troops.
stop you there briefly, Alicia. Have you heard any news that there are Russians working on the side of Ukraine in this offensive, anti-Putin groups?
I can say not about the Russian military groups, but about Russian partisans, because we have witnessed some videos from the Kursk region on that matter. And we know that there are a large number of people in Russia who disagree with Kremlin's policies. And for that people, in Ukraine, we have state projects that could help them and contact them. So, as of Russian partisans at the Kursk territory, Kursk region territory, I would say that it is true that they will fight.
Okay, let's bring Pavel. Pavel, you can have the last word on that. How worried do you think the Kremlin might be at this moment?
I think they're very worried because they don't know what's coming next. Ukraine has the initiative right now in the north, and they have broke through. They are operationally free. They can try to say go for the Kursk nuclear power plant, but maybe that they'll just feint that and say they can turn south and into the Belgorod region and begin to roll back the entire Russian front from the rear. That depends, of course, on their plans and also absolutely on how much reserves they manage to secretly put together, how deep and seriously they can punch in. Can they actually overturn a large part of the Russian front, or they're just going to be going into Russia, maybe then holding a bit of Russian territory, which is very embarrassing. But that is not really totally crucial for the Russian regime, for Moscow. And I believe right now for Moscow, the worst possible scenario is that there's a serious destabilization of the front line in the north, and that Russia, like in September 22, would have to declare a partial mobilization, additional partial mobilization, which would be very detrimental, politically speaking and economically speaking, for
Okay,
Russia.
Pavel. That's very interesting. Thank you to all 3 of our guests today, Alicia Horiainova, Pavel Felgen-Hoyer and Patrick Bury. It's a fast-moving situation, but you can watch and follow Al Jazeera for the latest developments. Our website is aljazeera.com. What do you think about the situation? Your comments are welcome on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at us on what's now officially called X. We are at AJ Inside Story. For all of us here, thanks for joining us. I'll see you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.